The assassination of President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater changed the nation forever. However, his assassination was not the first plot to get rid of our 16th president. General Ulysses S. Grant had stopped prisoner of war exchanges. John Wilkes Booth and others believed that kidnapping Lincoln would convince him to change his mind. To carry out his plans, John Wilkes Booth enlisted the help of 6 men: Surratt, Samuel Arnold, George A. Atzerodt, Michael O'Lowlin, David E. Harold, and Lewis Powell. One plan was to capture Lincoln while he was watching a play in Ford's Theater. They would kidnap the president in his box, lower him down onto the stage, and carry him out of the theater. This plan was never carried out though, as some of the men thought it just wasn't possible. Another plot was to capture the president while he was traveling to Soldiers' Home. Located several miles from the White House in what was then rural Washington County, the Soldiers' Home was Lincoln's main residence during the hot summer months. The president would often take a carriage ride there with little or no protection, making him a vulnerable target. Lincoln had changed his plans at the last moment to attend a reception at the National Hotel in Washington, where Booth was staying. These were not the only plots, though, to kidnap Lincoln. On March 17, 1865, Booth was told the president was going to be at the Campbell Military Hospital to see a play. They had very little notice. The group met at a nearby restaurant to get the plan in order. They would stop the carriage as Lincoln returned home after the play, overpower the president and his driver, then handcuff both of them and take them across the Potomac River through southern Maryland. They felt that they wouldn't get caught. The group had quick horses, knowledge of the countryside, and had planned to get rid of the carriage once they were out of D.C. After the meeting, Booth decided to go to the hospital and make sure everything was set. To his surprise and disappointment, Lincoln wasn't there. So after this failed attempt, some of the group gave up. However, after the failure to carry out the abduction plot in March and Union's capture of Richmond in early April, Booth's attitude apparently changed. Booth, it seemed, felt that the time for patience had ended. Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt were co-conspirators with Booth. Powell was 20 and a former Confederate soldier wounded at Gettysburg. Harold was 22, pharmacist assistant, and Atzerodt was 29, a German-born carriage painter. He spoke about his doubts of the plot. The conspirators made plans at 42-year-old Mary Surratt's boarding house. She also was assisting the conspirators with weapons. Timing was everything. They had to work together to commit their crimes at the same time so as not to alarm people prematurely. They agreed on everything being at the time of 10:15. Secretary of State Seward was one of the victims in the plot. He was bedridden after having a serious carriage accident. Powell went to Seward's home and claimed to have a prescription for Seward. Seward's servant, William Bell, a former slave, tried to keep Powell from getting to Seward's. Seward's son, Frederick, heard the commotion and came out to investigate. Powell attempted to shoot him with an 1858 Whitney naval revolver, but misfired. He then clubbed Frederick with the gun. Bell ran to help to General Augur's next door. Meanwhile, Powell entered the room and he slashed Seward's guard, George Robinson. He then pushed past Seward's daughter, Fanny, and his nurse, and jumped onto Seward and began stabbing him in the face and the throat. When he thought he had killed him, he was going to leave. Fanny screamed murder so loud that Harold, who was waiting outside, got nervous and abandoned Powell. Seward's other son came into the room where he and a wounded Robinson trying to get him to the floor. Powell stabbed the 2 of them and ran downstairs. A state messenger, Bud Hansel, was just coming in. Seeing Powell, he tried to escape. Powell stabbed him as well. As his accomplice was gone and Powell had no idea where to go now, he may have spent the night in a cemetery to hide. Booth assigned George Atzerodt to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson. On that morning, Atzerodt booked a room at 126 at the Kirkwood House in Washington, where Johnson was also. Atzerodt, for whatever reason, did not have the courage to kill Andrew Johnson. He began drinking heavily at the hotel bar and became intoxicated, and he simply lost his nerve. He then drunkenly began walking out on the streets of Washington for the rest of the night. As he walked, Atzerodt dropped his knife in a nearby gutter. A woman noticed this and contacted the police. Atzerodt had asked the bartender about Johnson's whereabouts. The bartender became suspicious the day following Lincoln's assassination. An employee of the hotel contacted the police regarding a suspicious-looking man in a gray coat. Atzerodt booked a night at another hotel. Military police searched Atzeroth's room on April 15th and found a loaded revolver concealed under his pillow, as well as a concealed Bowie knife. The police also found a bank book belonging to Booth in the room. Atzeroth was arrested on April 20th at the house of his cousin, Hartmut Richter, in Germantown, Maryland. President Lincoln was attending Ford's Theater to see Our American Cousin. He had a premonition of the event 3 days earlier. His footman, William Crooks, had asked him not to go. His wife, Mary Todd, had a headache and may have not wanted to go, but Lincoln still felt obligated. He was late, and the band played Hail to the Chief as he entered. In the balcony with Lincoln and his wife, Mrs. Lincoln, was Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, Julie, were initially invited, but Julie and Mary Todd were not exactly the best of friends. They didn't go. At 10:15, Booth slipped into the box and fired his .44 caliber single-shot Derringer pistol in the back of Lincoln's head. He ended up stabbing Rathbone in the forearm, who had immediately rushed at him. Booth leapt off the stage and caught his boot spur on the Treasury flag that was hanging on the balcony. This caused him to land awkwardly and break his leg. Booth then may have shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is "thus ever to the tyrants," the Virginia state motto. The audience at the theater thought this was all part of the play at first. However, when Mary Todd Lincoln began screaming, they realized what happened. Rathbone began yelling, "Stop that man!" Major Joseph Stewart climbed over the orchestra pit in pursuit. Booth stabbed the orchestra leader while escaping. He managed to get out and even hit Joseph Burrow, who was outside and tending to his horse, with his knife. Now, what are the last words? It's believed that at one point, Mary whispered to Lincoln, who was still holding her hand, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" And Lincoln replied, "She won't think anything about it." Some say that they were actually talking about Jerusalem. Now, a young army surgeon, Charles Lee, was in the audience and rushed to the Lincoln. Booth had jammed the door with a wooden brace, so Rathbone had to let him in. Lincoln's head was leaning forward and he was having difficulty breathing. Actress Laura Keene rushed to the balcony to help. She laid Lincoln's head in her lap as he was examined. After helping him breathe, they decided the wound was fatal. They took him out of the theater in the rain and into the house of William Peterson. Shortly before 7 a.m., Mary was allowed to return to Lincoln's side. She again seated herself by the president, kissing him and calling him every endearing name. Lincoln then died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th. Mary Lincoln was not present. John Wilkes Booth met up with David Harold at the home of Sam Mudd, who was the doctor who mended his leg. They then went to Samuel Cox's house, who guided them through the Zacchaeus swamp. They hid there for 5 days before crossing the Potomac River. On the afternoon of April 24th, they arrived at the farm of Richard H. Garrett, who's a tobacco farmer in King George County, Virginia. Booth told Garrett that he was a wounded Confederate soldier. On April 26th, the 16 New York Cavalry caught up to Booth and Harold sleeping in Garrett's barn. They threatened to set fire to the structure. Harold gave up, but Booth refused. After the fire was set, Booth tried to leave out the back with a pistol and a rifle. Sergeant Boston Corbett came around back and shot Booth in the back of the head, almost identical to the way Booth had shot Lincoln. It severed his spinal cord. Soldiers brought him out, and he told them, "Tell my mother I died for my country." He couldn't move his arms, and he asked a soldier to move them for him. He then proclaimed, "They are useless." When the military went to Mary Surratt's boarding house to arrest her, Lewis Powell arrived at the door disguised as a ditch digger, but he looked a little too refined and dressed a little too well, and so they caught him and he was arrested. Powell, along with Mary Surratt, George Atzeroth, and David Harold, were all found guilty. The court petitioned new President Andrew Johnson to have Mary Surratt given life in prison. Now, it's controversial if you ever saw the petition or not. Many say she was innocent. She and the other three were then hung on July 7th, 1865 at Fort McNair. Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, and Michael O'Lallin were given life sentences, but President Johnson pardoned them. Major Rathbone ended up marrying Clara Harris, and they had 3 children. Now, here's what's strange. Unfortunately, he later in his life had a mental breakdown of sorts, and on a trip to Germany in 1882, he killed Clara and then attacked his children, but he was stopped. He then tried to stab himself, but he lived. He was then committed to a mental facility in 1911, where he died. Boston Corbett had endured the famed Confederate prison at Andersonville. After shooting John Wilkes Booth, he was arrested for shooting against orders. He later claimed self-defense and became a hero, although many people later harassed him about the killing. Corbett was appointed assistant doorkeeper of the Kansas House of Representatives in Topeka in January 1887. On February 15th, he became convinced that officers of the House were discriminating against him. He jumped to his feet, brandished a revolver, and began chasing the officers out of the building. No one was hurt, and Corbett was arrested. The following day, a judge declared Corbett insane and sent him to the Topeka Asylum for the Insane. He then escaped and disappeared. Today, Keene's dress is not intact, and a piece has been auctioned off for $125,000. Clara Rathbone restored the blood-soaked dress in her family's summer house in Loudonville, New York, near Albany. Supposedly, Clara could still hear gunshots and Lincoln's voice coming from within the closet she kept that blood-soaked dress in. She eventually had the closet boarded up. Her son removed the bricks, believing that the dress had a curse on the family, and had the dress burned in 1910. Here's something else that's interesting. Lincoln's deathbed was actually slept in by Booth only a few months before. William Peterson was charging people to see the bed. The bed has passed hands a few times, and it's now in the Chicago History Museum. Abraham Lincoln was actually also a fan of John Wilkes Booth, having seen him in the play The Marble Heart in 1863. Lincoln had actually invited him to the White House, but Booth did not go. Booth was at Lincoln's second inauguration in 1865. Maybe one of the biggest ironies of all is that Lincoln ended up signing into his legislation the Secret Service program that protects the president. Well, this is one of the most famous, tragic, and impactful events in all of American history. The country might have turned out very differently if he was never president, and also if he was never assassinated. That is strange indeed.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth for freedom, and that government of the people, by the people.
We'll keep the videos coming here on Strange History. Want to see more videos about the strange and interesting side of history? Well, check out our video on the Alamo.